What if I told you that slavery was much worse than we tend to think? In textbooks, we read about great empires, kings, and military leaders, but we rarely hear about those who created all of this, the slaves. These were millions of people who were deprived of their freedom, turned into objects, and had their lives controlled by others. We often think that slavery is just hard labor and whips, but history has seen traditions that were far more horrific. Slaves were sacrificed to the gods. Children were sold in markets for less than food. Women were turned into concubines, locked up in harems, and had no right to say no. Men were sent to the arena where they had to kill each other for entertainment. There were also those who were kept as living toys to amuse the guests of wealthy masters. To us, this sounds like a nightmare, but for ancient people, it was considered normal. That's how society was structured. Some lived in luxury, while others suffered and died, their lives meaningless. In this episode, we'll explore the most shocking traditions of slavery, stories that are frightening, but they show just how cruel humans can be to each other. Slavery has existed for as long as civilization itself. Wherever cities and states appeared, slaves appeared too. It was the basis of the economy and power. In ancient Egypt, slaves worked in the fields and in the homes of the nobility. In Mesopotamia, they were used to build temples and canals. In ancient Greece, slaves made up a third of the population, and in Rome, even more. Without slaves, these empires could not have existed. But it is important to understand that slavery did not always look the same. In some places, slaves could become free, while in others, they remained property forever. In some places, slaves had rights, while in others, their lives were worth less than food for livestock. For most societies, a slave was primarily a commodity. He could be bought, sold, exchanged, or punished. He had no right to decide where to live, whom to love, or what to do. His life depended entirely on the will of his master. Slavery arose for various reasons. Most often it was due to wars. Defeated enemies became slaves to the victors. Sometimes debtors, or even one's own children, were sold into slavery. There were also cases when a person was born into slavery and had no chance of escaping it. Slavery was convenient for the rich. Slaves worked in the fields, in mines, in workshops, and served in houses and palaces. But slavery had another side to it. It became part of traditions and culture. And it is these traditions that strike us with their cruelty. History preserves references to sacrifices, when slaves were killed to appease the gods. We know about gladiatorial combat, where slaves fought to the death for the entertainment of the crowd. We know about female slaves who were turned into concubines and locked up in harems. Sometimes it seems like these are stories from dark legends, but archaeology and chronicles confirm that all of this was reality. For centuries, people considered normal what sounds like a crime to us today. Slavery knew no boundaries. It existed in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the Arab Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, all the great powers relied on slave labor, and each of them left behind shocking traditions. Today we will take a closer look at these traditions, not as dry facts, but as real human stories. How did children who were sold at the market feel? How did a girl who was made a concubine in a harem live? What did a gladiator think when he entered the arena, knowing that he would most likely not return alive? This is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror that shows how cruel humans can be, and it is a reminder that such pages of history must never be forgotten. In ancient societies, slaves were often used not only as laborers, but also as sacrificial offerings. In Mesopotamia, and later in some Central American cultures, slaves were killed in temples. Their blood was considered a gift to the gods, and their death was a way to cleanse their master's sins. Similar customs were also found in Africa and Asia. Sometimes slaves were sacrificed during the construction of buildings to strengthen them. Archaeologists have found human remains in the foundations of ancient buildings. People believed that the spirit of the murdered person would protect the walls. For the slaves themselves, this meant that they could die at any moment, not from disease or punishment, but simply because tradition dictated it. This was one of the most horrific aspects of slavery. The fate of children was particularly tragic. In ancient Rome, babies were sold in markets for less than food. They were not given names, they were marked with a brand. These children were used as servants, apprentices to craftsmen or shepherds. But often children ended up in the most brutal conditions, in mines and workshops. Their small stature allowed them to be used where adults could not fit. Their lives were short and painful. Some girls were sold to brothels or made concubines of the rich. Their childhood ended before it had even begun. These stories show that slavery destroyed lives before people even had a chance to understand what freedom was. One of the most severe forms of slavery was sexual slavery. Girls and young women were taken into harems. In the Ottoman Empire, concubines lived in luxury, but were completely deprived of their freedom. They could be bought at the market, kidnapped during wars, or even given as gifts. In the harem, they had to obey their master's every whim. Disobedience was punished severely, even with death. The lives of thousands of women were ruined. They had no choice, no voice, no right to decide their own lives. For many of them, the harem became a golden cage from which there was no escape. In Rome, many slaves became gladiators. They were forced to enter the arena and fight to the death. For the crowd, it was a show. For the slaves, it was a death sentence. The Colosseum and other arenas became symbols of cruelty. Thousands of lives were lost amid the cries of spectators. The victors received glory, but rarely freedom. Gladiators were slave stars. They were admired, but they remained objects at the disposal of their masters. Their blood was spilled on the sand for entertainment. It was one of the most terrible forms of slavery, turning human life into a game for the crowd. Some aristocrats had a strange pastime, keeping slaves as living toys. Such people were dressed up in ridiculous costumes and forced to entertain guests, sing, dance, and joke around. Sometimes slaves with physical characteristics were specifically chosen to be ridiculed. This was a form of humiliation that turned a person into an object of amusement. They had no right to refuse. Such traditions existed not only in Rome, but also in medieval Europe and the East. This shows that slavery manifested itself not only in hard labor, but also in sophisticated forms of abuse. When we think of slavery, we often imagine hard labor, punishment, or markets where people were sold as commodities. But sometimes, cruelty went beyond all limits. One of the most horrific traditions was burying slaves alongside their masters. This practice was found in different cultures, but archaeologists have found particularly striking examples in ancient China. When a nobleman or ruler died, his slaves, concubines, and sometimes even warriors were buried with him. It was believed that in the afterlife, the master needed to continue living surrounded by those who had served him during his lifetime. Archaeologists find mass graves where dozens of other bodies lie next to the body of a rich person. These people did not die a natural death. They were killed specifically for the ritual. Sometimes they were women and children. Their lives were cut short only because their master died. An ancient burial site of a ruler was discovered in Henan province, where more than 200 people were laid to rest alongside him. Most of them were slaves and concubines. Their fate was sealed on the day their master died. Such findings show that slavery was not limited to an economic role. It permeated culture and religion. For centuries, people believed that the death of one person gave the right to take the lives of dozens of others. Similar practices were found in other regions. In Africa and the Middle East, slaves were sometimes killed at the funerals of chiefs. In Scandinavia, there are references to the fact that a chief's concubine slave was burned along with him so that she could serve him in Valhalla. These traditions shock us today. But for ancient societies, it was part of their worldview. A slave was not considered a person with his own destiny. He was merely part of the property that accompanied his master even after death. Such stories are a terrible reminder. Slavery not only deprived people of their freedom, but also deprived them of their very right to life and death. Their existence ended the moment their master no longer needed them. The history of slavery is not just a story about the past, it is a mirror in which we see ourselves. Over thousands of years, people have built the greatest cities, created empires, written books, and erected temples. But all this was built on the shoulders of those who had been deprived of their freedom. We often marvel at the grandeur of the pyramids, the marble of the Colosseum, and the wealth of the palaces, but we rarely think about the price at which all this was created. Behind every column and stone slab lie the fates of those whose names have been lost to history. Millions of slaves died nameless, and only archaeology and chronicles remind us of them. The most shocking traditions of slavery show us how cruel humans can be. Human sacrifices, child markets, sexual slavery, gladiatorial combat, and abuse for entertainment were all considered normal. What seems like savage cruelty to us was once considered part of culture and religion. Today, slavery in this form no longer exists. But we must not forget the lessons of the past. This memory is necessary not only for the sake of history, but also for the sake of the future. To ensure that such practices are never repeated, we must remember that every human life has value. Slavery is not just a part of history, it is a reminder that any civilization can be built on suffering, and it is up to us to decide whether the future of humanity will be based on freedom and dignity or on repeating the same mistakes. Thanks for watching this video. If you found it interesting to learn the truth about the most shocking traditions of slavery, please support the channel with a like and subscribe. This helps us find new topics and tell stories that rarely make it into textbooks. In the next episode, we'll talk about how the myth of millions of slaves building the pyramids came about and why it still lives on in the popular imagination. Don't miss it. There will be many surprises. Leave your comments. Which story from this episode shocked you the most? We will definitely read your opinions and choose topics for future videos.